I tried to alert a car dealership about what they were doing. They were charging an elderly couple 18 interest, even though their sign clearly advertised 0. Instead of correcting the issue, they started throwing my keys around like a football until the fob broke apart, then deflated my tires, all while the owner stood there filming my humiliation. But I pulled out my state inspector badge. That's when everything changed. Turned out, they'd been running a scam operation for 2 decades, specifically targeting elderly folks and immigrants. The owner had even been using my late grandfather's training manual to teach his team how to manipulate people into signing contracts. Then he started tailing me everywhere in a Honda that looked just like mine. In the end, it was his own daughter who found the evidence that led to the takedown of 6 dealerships. I'm the state inspector who shut down 6 car dealerships for fraud last year. This all started last Saturday when I went to Premier Auto to shop for a new car. I had on some beat-up jeans and an old Tame Impala hoodie. The place was packed, which I figured was a good sign. While waiting, I noticed a salesman helping an older couple. He was telling them the APR was 18, even though the massive banner right outside the office window said 0 APR. So I politely flagged the guy down, a college-age kid with way too much hair gel. "Hey," I said, "your sign out front says 0. But that couple's getting 18. Just thought you should know." He rolled his eyes. "Sir, we know how to sell cars. Been doing this for 20 years. I started explaining the legal implications, but he walked away mid-sentence. 5 minutes later, the finance manager came out, big guy, 30s, tight polo shirt, flashy gold chain. "Listen, pal," he said, "why don't you go back to your video games and let the grown-ups sell cars? We don't need some kid telling us our business." I kept my composure. "I'm just pointing out that your advertised rate doesn't match what you're offering." He let out this exaggerated laugh that made half the showroom turn to look. "You millennials think you know everything because you read a Reddit thread. I've been in this game since before you even had a license." Other shoppers started glancing our way. He was clearly enjoying the spotlight. Then he grabbed my Honda keys from the desk without warning and tossed them across the showroom to another guy, Luke. My heart dropped. They started playing Keep Away. I tried to step in, but more salesmen joined, forming a circle. My keys flew over my head while they laughed and taunted me. I felt like I was back in school getting bullied. After about 30 seconds of this, Luke hurled the keys hard to another guy who missed. They hit the marble floor with a loud crack. The fob shattered, pieces scattering everywhere. I was shaking as I got down on my hands and knees to pick up the remains. That's when someone accidentally kicked my coffee. The cup tipped, brown liquid splashing across my shoes and pooling on the tile. The salesman walked past me like I wasn't there, tracking coffee across the floor. My face burned. I was beyond humiliated. "If you don't like our process, there's a used car lot down the road for people like you," someone sneered. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. That's when the owner, Darren, appeared. He took one look at me kneeling on the floor and shook his head. He whispered something to security, then raised his voice to the room. "This is what happens when you let just anyone walk in thinking they know better than us." A security guard, huge, at least 6'4", grabbed me by the shoulder and yanked me to my feet. His grip hurt. He marched me to the door as the sales team clapped. Actually clapped. A few customers looked uncomfortable, but no one said a word. My legs were trembling. I'd never felt so publicly degraded. They shoved me through the doors. I stumbled, nearly falling. But it wasn't over. I was outside, trying to tape the key fob back together, when 3 salesmen walked over to my Honda. My pulse spiked. Luke had a valve stem tool. I watched him crouch by my front tire, unscrewing the cap. The hissing started right away, in broad daylight, right in front of other customers. Within minutes, both driver's side tires were flat. My car leaned pitifully to one side. The 3 of them strutted back into the dealership, high-fiving. Through the giant showroom windows, I could see the whole sales team lined up, phones out, filming me. Darren stood front and center, arms crossed, wearing the kind of smile that said he thought he'd won. I stood there for a while. 2 flat tires, broken key fob, shoes soaked in coffee. But the story didn't end there, because I wasn't just some random kid in a hoodie. I was the state inspector they didn't see coming. My whole body was shaking, not from fear, but from a tightly controlled, burning rage, until I smiled and reached into my back pocket. The walk back to the showroom felt like a movie scene in slow motion. The same security guard stepped in front of me again. Without a word, I flipped open my leather badge wallet and flashed my official inspector credentials. His entire demeanor changed on the spot. The color drained from his face. I brushed past him and walked straight toward Darren. The room went silent. My voice was steady, measured. "State Automotive Inspector, and you just failed your surprise inspection. Congratulations." Darren's coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered against the tile. He stammered something about a misunderstanding, but it was already too late. I'd documented everything. I was ready to bring the hammer down. My inspection tablet was already in hand, the official state app booting up while Darren's expression transformed from smug to pale and panicked. He fumbled for his phone while I moved toward the finance manager's desk, where the elderly couple's contracts were still out in the open. "Get the lawyer on the line," Darren barked at his assistant, his voice cracking under pressure. The speakerphone came to life in the dead silent room. "What kind of problem now, Darren?" a weary voice asked. "Just an inspection hiccup. Standard policy stuff. We've handled worse." The words hung in the air like poison. Standard policy. Every customer within earshot turned to stare. I kept my expression neutral as I continued taking notes, but inside I felt that familiar rush like the case was assembling itself right in front of me. The security guard, the same one who had dragged me out earlier, came over with trembling hands. "Sir, I didn't know you were with the state. Did I hurt your shoulder?" He trailed off as I calmly rolled up my sleeve, revealing the darkening bruise from his grip. Then I angled my phone camera toward the dealership logo in the background and took clear photos, each image auto-uploaded to my supervisor's secure server. Across the room, Luke tried to quietly inch toward the exit. The valve stem tool was still sticking out of his back pocket. In his panic, it fell. The metal clattered across the showroom floor, spinning to a stop at the feet of a young mother holding her toddler. She looked down, then out the window at my flattened tires, and something in her expression shifted, pure understanding. I pressed the call button for my supervisor, putting it on speaker. "Rodriguez here," came the answer. "I'm at Belridge Motors, license number 7829. We've got an active situation, possible assault on a state official, destruction of state property, and early evidence of systemic rate fraud." The finance manager went ghost white. He spun to his computer, typing furiously. Anyone with half a brain could see he was deleting records. Several customers had their phones out now, recording. A woman in her 20s near the reception desk was typing like mad. I caught a glimpse of her screen. Belridge Motors fraud exposed. Live, then the elderly couple stepped forward. The wife held up her phone. "Inspector, this is our contract. 18, just like you said." Her husband pointed at the big window sign. "That sign says 0. We asked, and they told us we didn't qualify." I snapped photos of their contract, noting signatures and dates. Darren stepped between us, his coffee-soaked shoes squeaking on the tile. "This is all a misunderstanding. Mr. and Mrs. Liang, we can fix this. You know we support the local youth baseball league, the senior center. The rate is 18, Mrs. Liang said clearly. You told us it was the best you could do." The tension in the room broke. The showroom exploded with noise. Two salesmen bolted for the exit. The receptionist was crying behind her desk. Customers halfway through negotiations were now demanding to see their paperwork. Darren's phone rang again, his wife this time. In his panic, he forgot to take it off speaker. "Honey, I need Davidson's number. The lawyer, not the accountant fast." Then a younger voice chimed in, confused. "Daddy, I'm in your office doing homework. What's going on out here? Everyone's yelling." Darren's face twisted. "Sophie, sweetheart, just stay in the office. Don't come out." But Sophie had already opened the office door, backpack slung over one shoulder. She froze when she saw the chaos, customers shouting, employees fleeing, her father standing in spilled coffee while a state inspector documented everything. Her voice was steady. "Dad, I made a decision." I nodded at her. "Miss, you should gather your things. This is now an active investigation." She looked stunned, but nodded back, her eyes wide. I followed her toward the office. Darren tried to intervene, but I held up a hand. "I'm ensuring a minor's safety during an active investigation." Sophie hurried to grab her textbooks from the desk, accidentally knocking over a filing box in her rush. Papers spilled across the office floor. Employee complaints. Years' worth. Unfair commission demands. Coercion to lie about financing rates. Threats of termination for refusing to upsell or deceive. Each complaint signed, each dated, each ignored. "Oh my God," Sophie whispered, reading over my shoulder as I snapped photos of every document. "Dad, these people said you made them." Darren rushed in and dropped to his knees beside her. "Sophie, baby, it's not." This is just how business works. The market's tough. We have to stay ahead. The baseball team sponsorships, the church donations, your college tuition. This is how we pay for it all. She pulled away from him. By cheating people? The finance manager appeared in the doorway, pale and sweating. Darren, we need to align our statements. The inspector's trying to twist everything. Twist? I replied calmly. These are your employees' words, not mine. Then Luke shoved past the finance manager. This is ridiculous. Darren, tell them how you always made us inflate the rates. Tell them about the bonuses for whoever could squeeze the most out of people. I told you this would come back to bite us. Shut up, Luke, the finance manager snapped. No, I'm done, Luke said, his voice cracking. I told you the valve stem trick was too much. I told you we'd eventually mess with the wrong person. There's something fascinating about the way people turn on each other the moment a badge shows up. Luke suddenly remembered every ethical objection he'd raised. The finance manager was scrambling to craft a cover story. Sophie stood over years of ignored whistleblower documents. It all started unraveling faster than I could keep up. But you said it was funny, Luke said bitterly. You said it'd teach people to keep their mouths shut. I kept documenting, my tablet capturing every detail, every word. On the finance manager's desk, half concealed under a coffee mug, I spotted doctored contracts' whiteout edits, mismatched signatures, manipulated numbers. Clear evidence, but I couldn't collect it officially without a warrant. Everybody calm down, Darren said, trying to salvage control. The inspector's doing his job. We'll cooperate, totally. Let's just talk in my office, yeah? Professionally. I'll need to finish my initial sweep first, I replied, heading toward the customer restroom to take notes in private. As I entered, I jotted down my observations, preparing my preliminary report. That's when the bathroom door burst open. The finance manager stood there, phone camera recording. Got him! He's in here scheming, probably planting evidence. I turned toward him calmly and rinsed my hands. Using the restroom during a multi-hour inspection isn't illegal. But Darren was already trying to spin it. See, he barges in here, creates chaos, assaults my staff, and now he's hiding in the bathroom inventing stories. This is harassment. Back in the showroom, the independent news blogger was already interviewing customers. Mr. and Mrs. Liang stood proudly at the center, holding their contract for everyone to see. Other customers started comparing paperwork. One by one, they found similar inconsistencies. The giant Zero APR banner still hung mockingly in the window. Then my phone buzzed, a message from my supervisor. Chamber of Commerce president just called. Says you're disrupting a pillar of the community. Tread carefully. I scanned the room. Darren on the phone, frantically whispering to lawyers. His daughter crying in the office. Employees turning on each other. Customers demanding answers. The finance manager purging files, Luke unraveling publicly, footage being reviewed, witnesses everywhere, evidence everywhere, protocols to follow. The weight of what came next pressed down hard on my shoulders. This wasn't just one shady dealership anymore. Darren's standard practices line to his attorney pointed to a network, and the blogger's posts were already spreading. The chamber's involvement meant political pressure was on its way. I thought about the 6 dealerships I'd shut down last year. Each one took months. Each case wrecked careers, tore open communities, but I also remembered the families who'd lost tens of thousands, seniors who trusted the wrong people, immigrants who were taken advantage of, lives ruined over paperwork and lies. Sophie walked slowly from the office, backpack on her shoulder, carefully stepping around the shattered mug and coffee puddle. At the door, she paused and looked back at her father. Mom always said, she said softly, your success came too easy. Then she walked out. Now I understand why, Sophie said quietly before walking out. Darren's face collapsed as he watched his daughter disappear through the showroom doors. The finance manager was still hammering away at his keyboard, desperately trying to delete files. Luke stood off to the side, clearly realizing he'd already said far too much. The elderly couple waited patiently to give their statements. I stood in the middle of it all, tablet in hand, knowing this was only the beginning. My phone rang. Rodriguez again. The director wants you in his office first thing Monday morning. Says there are concerns about your methods, claims you're disrupting local businesses without proper justification. The Chamber of Commerce president is filing a formal complaint. I glanced at my tablet. filled with documented evidence-doctored contracts, years of employee grievances, customer-recorded admissions, the standard practices statement to their lawyer. It was all there, but it wouldn't mean a thing if I got pulled off the case. Understood, I told Rodriguez. I'll have my preliminary report ready. As I prepared to leave, Darren approached me one last time. The frantic panic he'd shown earlier had calcified into something colder. "You think you're a hero?" he said, voice low. "You just cost 50 people their jobs. That's 50 families depending on this dealership." "The only one who cost them their jobs," I replied calmly, "is the man who decided fraud was a viable business strategy." He leaned in. The scent of overpriced cologne and stale coffee clung to him. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he growled. "I've been a pillar in this community for 20 years. I know people. And by Monday, everyone will know about you, the inspector who gets off on ruining small businesses." I looked him straight in the eye. "Then I guess we both have work to do this weekend." As I walked back to my Honda still listing on 2 flattened tires, I felt every gaze on me. Some sympathetic, some hostile, all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The valve stem tool still lay on the floor where Luke had dropped it. That one petty act of harassment had unraveled something far bigger than they expected. While calling for a tow truck, my phone buzzed again. The blogger's post was going viral. Save Belridge Motors was already trending locally. Comments flooded in. Some hailed me as a whistleblowing hero. Others accused me of being a bureaucratic bully out to destroy community businesses. It always started like this: the exposure, the pushback, the smear campaign. But this time felt different. Darren wasn't just another crooked car salesman. He had clout. He had connections. He had a daughter who'd just realized who he really was. He had everything to lose. And now, apparently, so did I. The tow truck arrived within 20 minutes. The driver, a grizzled man in his 50s, took one look at the deflated tires and let out a sigh. Without a word, he began loading my Honda onto the flatbed. I stood there, still absorbing everything that had happened. My phone continued buzzing. Notifications stacked up, but I ignored them. I had a job to finish. That night, back at my apartment, I spread everything across my dining table: photos of the bruise forming on my arm, screenshots of the Liang couple's contract, images of the scattered employee complaints in Darren's office. The valve stem tool. Every detail preserved, labeled, and backed up across multiple secure cloud servers. The glow of my laptop screen reflected off cold coffee and exhaustion. My fingers typed steadily, outlining every violation, every irregularity, every breach exactly as state procedure required. No shortcuts, no missteps. Because if there was even a sliver of procedural error, Darren's legal team would use it to discredit the entire investigation. I worked through the night, fueled by bitterness, urgency, and freeze-dried caffeine. Sunday morning brought a new wave of complications. A knock at my door. It was my neighbor, looking uncomfortable. She explained that her son played on the youth baseball team sponsored by Belridge Motors. The coach had already sent out a warning email: if the dealership went under, so would the funding. She asked carefully if maybe I could. "Ease up." I told her, as gently as I could, that fraud doesn't become acceptable just because the check has a charity's name on it. She left without another word, but I could feel the weight of her judgment lingering in the silence. The coffee shop I visited every morning felt different on Monday. The barista, usually chatty, barely made eye contact as she prepared my usual. In the back corner, at my usual booth, sat Darren, calm, composed, sipping espresso. He looked up, raised his cup in a slow, mocking toast. Message received. This is my turf. I took my coffee to go. The state office felt different, too. The hallways were quieter than usual. Conversations cut off the moment I walked by. Eyes tracked my every step. Word spreads fast in this department. Everyone already knew about the Chamber of Commerce complaint. The director's office felt smaller than usual. She sat behind her desk, fingers steepled in front of her, while the deputy director occupied the seat to her right. They had already reviewed my preliminary report, but their expressions gave away nothing. The meeting lasted 2 full hours. They questioned every move I'd made, every decision, every line of evidence. They reminded me of procedure, the importance of maintaining positive relationships with local businesses, the need to balance enforcement with community trust. I defended my actions calmly, point by point, but I could feel the pressure, political, institutional, settling around me like a noose. Finally, the director laid down her verdict. I could continue the investigation, but under strict conditions. I was now required to submit daily progress reports and CC the legal department on every piece of communication. Any further action against Belridge Motors would need pre-approval. They'd put me on a leash. When I stepped into the hallway, I found Rodriguez waiting. He pulled me aside, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. He warned me that Darren had been making calls all weekend, that he had friends in the state government, people who owed him favors, people who could make my life very difficult. Rodriguez wanted to help, but his wife had just started a new job at a Bank One that happened to handle auto loans for Belridge Motors. He couldn't risk her position. "Watch your back," he said quietly. Then he walked away. The next few days became a slow, careful dance. I continued investigating within the strict boundaries set by the director. I filed public records requests for every business license tied to Darren. What I found made my stomach churn. Shell companies upon shell companies, layered deliberately to obscure liability, dozens of them all connected to Darren. The same pattern of deception echoed through each one, used car lots scattered across the county. Most were in low-income neighborhoods, preying on people with bad credit, little recourse, and no alternatives. Public records showed years of complaints, 5 years' worth each, echoing the same grievances. Advertised rates that mysteriously vanished at signing. Hidden fees, contracts with mismatched terms. Sales pitches that didn't match the paperwork. The pattern was unmistakable, but pattern alone wasn't enough. I needed evidence of intentional fraud, so I began visiting the addresses listed under Darren's network of businesses. Most of the lots were small, rundown, and clearly designed to avoid scrutiny. The sales staff at these locations were nervous when I arrived. Someone had warned them. They knew who I was, but many were also worn down, exhausted from years of selling lies. Some wanted to speak up. Most were too scared. One afternoon, while combing through public social media posts about Belridge Motors, I stumbled onto something useful. Someone had posted a screenshot. Darren playing the victim, whining about state overreach. Meanwhile, his finance manager had literally been caught deleting files in front of a crowd. Customers were openly comparing contracts online, discovering they'd all been duped in the exact same way. I couldn't help but wonder, how did Darren think this would end any differently? Then I found Jake's Instagram account, the same salesman who flattened my tires. Months of bragging posts. He showed off massive commission checks, amounts far higher than what Belridge Motors had reported to the state. Either Jake was lying or Darren's dealership was underreporting sales to dodge taxes. I screenshot everything, added it to the ever-growing file. But I also noticed something new. I was being watched. Anonymous accounts started following my social media. They were digging into my old posts. Screenshots started circulating, particularly one from 2 years ago where I'd praised Belridge's community outreach program, back when I had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Darren's team was building their own file on me. And it didn't stop there. Darren started appearing wherever I went. At my gym, the grocery store, even the dry cleaner. He never spoke, never crossed a legal line. Just loomed. He'd even swapped his luxury sedan for a Honda identical to mine. He made sure I saw it parked near mine, lined up beside me in traffic, always watching, always reminding me that I was being tracked. The psychological pressure was intensifying. Then I got called in again. My supervisor looked exhausted. A complaint had been filed, accusing me of stalking Belridge Motors after hours. Security footage from nearby businesses showed my car driving past the dealership multiple times late at night. What the footage didn't show was that I was following standard investigative protocols, monitoring vehicle traffic, checking for after-hours activity, documenting patterns. But that didn't matter now, because the narrative had shifted, and I wasn't the only one telling it anymore. But context didn't matter. The complaint had been filed formally. It was now a permanent part of my professional record. I tried reaching out to former Belridge Motors employees, hoping someone might finally speak up. Most ignored my messages. A few returned my calls, but only to tell me they were bound by strict non-disclosure agreements and had been threatened with legal action if they talked. Darren had covered his bases well. Then I caught a break. A public records request revealed that Belridge's longtime accountant had resigned suddenly 6 months prior. Her name was Melissa Kurt, and she'd worked at the dealership for 8 years before walking away without notice. I tracked her down to a small tax prep firm across town. Melissa was hesitant to meet, but after several polite messages, she agreed to coffee at a quiet shop far from either of our offices. She arrived visibly nervous, glancing over her shoulder every few minutes. Still, she spoke. Melissa told me she had documented her concerns in a private spreadsheet tracking the discrepancies between advertised loan rates and the terms that appeared in customer contracts. She said she tried to bring the issue up to Darren, but he brushed it off, calling it a misunderstanding. Before she left Belridge, she'd uploaded her files to a shared cloud drive one she still had access to because no one had bothered to revoke her credentials. She gave me the login. "Download everything," she warned, "before they notice the security hole." I thanked her, standing to leave, but she grabbed my arm. "Be careful with Tom McAllister," she whispered. "The finance manager. He has major gambling debts. Darren knows. He uses it to control him. Tom's not just complicit, he's desperate." That evening, I accessed the cloud drive from a secure network. The files were staggering in both volume and detail. Melissa had archived everything: contract drafts, pricing sheets, internal communications. Her notes flagged inflated prices, manipulated terms, and even forged customer signatures. One folder showed a disturbing pattern. The most abusive contracts, the ones with predatory rates and hidden penalties, had signatures that didn't match Darren's usual style. Someone had been forging his name. I downloaded everything, knowing full well that I was technically accessing private business records without a warrant. I also knew this evidence could be the key. I'd find a legal way to bring it in later. For now, I needed to understand just how deep the rot went. The next morning brought another hurdle. An administrative judge had been assigned to review my entire investigation. Their task was to determine whether my actions stemmed from a personal vendetta against Belridge Motors. The judge would have access to all my files, every report I'd written, every complaint filed against me, plus the curated pile of social media posts Darren's team had assembled to discredit me. My entire career was under the microscope. I needed allies, but they were disappearing fast. Daniel, a former partner from another agency, now worked for a bank that financed Belridge's auto inventory. I called him, hoping for internal insight into their lending agreements. He wanted to help, but couldn't risk it. His daughter had just started college. He needed the job. Still, he gave me subtle leads mentions of inconsistencies in Premier's financing applications, potential red flags. But nothing on the record. This investigation wasn't just exhausting me, it was bleeding into the lives of anyone even remotely connected to it. Then I learned that the state had launched a surprise audit of Melissa Kurt's new workplace, supposedly due to irregularities in their filings. The timing was suspicious, too targeted to be coincidence. Melissa called me, crying. Her boss was furious, her husband was asking questions. Why had she gotten involved? Why had she risked everything for a place she no longer worked for? I felt the weight pressing down again. This was on me. People were suffering because they chose to do the right thing. And yet, I couldn't stop. Not when I knew how many families had been taken advantage of, not when I'd seen the pattern. So I pivoted. Instead of targeting Belridge Motors directly, I began researching Darren's mentor, the original owner of the business who'd passed away 3 years ago. Public records named him as Roger Rogers. Roger had a long history of consumer fraud complaints, stretching across multiple states. He'd never been successfully prosecuted, always staying just within legal gray zones. Clever, careful. He hadn't just sold Darren a dealership, he'd taught him how to run it. That changed things. If Darren had been trained from the beginning to believe these tactics were normal, it introduced doubt into the intent argument. And for criminal fraud charges, intentional deception is key. If Darren genuinely believed these practices were industry standard, if this was the only way he'd ever learned to do business, then proving criminal liability would be more difficult, but not impossible. Context mattered, just not the way the system always recognized it. But my sympathy had limits. I'd seen too many elderly couples, too many single moms, too many young families duped and drained by Belridge Motors. Whether Darren truly believed he was following industry norms or not, people were getting hurt, and the pressure on me kept mounting. Suddenly, my credit cards started getting declined despite having available balance. The companies cited suspicious activity, and I spent hours verifying transactions I hadn't made. Then my internet was mysteriously cut off. It took 3 different technicians over 4 days to restore the connection. Each incident was deniable, all of it plausibly explainable, but the pattern was unmistakable. Then came the meeting that changed everything. Tom McAllister, the finance manager, reached out through a mutual contact. He wanted to talk, quietly, somewhere off the record. We met at a gym on the edge of town. He said he worked out there. He looked awful, sleep-deprived, trembling. The smug arrogance I'd seen in our first encounter was gone. In whispered bursts between weight sets, Tom laid out his story. The gambling debts were worse than Melissa had known. He owed dangerous people, the kind who didn't offer payment plans. Darren had promised to help, but only if Tom followed orders without question. Tom had inflated loan rates, tacked on hidden fees, and misrepresented terms, but it had gone beyond that. In recent months, Tom had begun forging Darren's signature on the worst of the contracts, trying to shield his boss while still delivering the high profits demanded. He was trapped between mounting debts and a boss who owned him. He didn't know how to get out. I saw an opening. If Tom was willing to cooperate, to turn over real, detailed evidence of systematic fraud, we could build a case strong enough to break this open. But he was scared, deeply scared. He'd seen what happened to people who crossed Darren. I gave him my card. "Think about it," I said as he left. He limped slightly, walking out. He'd mentioned a recent accident, but the way he said it made it clear it hadn't been an accident. This wasn't just business fraud anymore. It was something darker, more dangerous. People were getting physically hurt. Lives were unraveling. Then the clock started ticking. My supervisor called with an update. The state attorney general's office was now involved. They were setting a deadline, 48 hours. That was how long I had to pull together a compelling case evidence strong enough to warrant formal prosecution. Otherwise, the entire investigation would be shut down. I worked non-stop. Every file, every document, every recorded complaint. Melissa's spreadsheets, screenshots, photos, all of it arranged, cataloged, submitted. But I knew it wasn't enough. It showed misconduct, but not intent, not criminal fraud. I needed something conclusive, undeniable, something that proved Darren knew what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway. That's when I made a decision I would regret for a long time. I contacted Tom again. This time, I changed tactics. I told him that protecting his family mattered more than any case file. But if he refused to cooperate, I'd have no choice but to submit everything, including his name, for review. That meant state officials would be scrutinizing his tax returns, his offshore debts, his gambling history. I hated myself for the threat. But I was running out of time, and options. Tom cracked. He agreed to a recorded statement, a full confession. On one condition, his wife and kids had to be relocated out of state before he testified. I agreed. I knew I might be making promises I couldn't keep. But it was the only way forward. We recorded the testimony in a cheap hotel room on the far edge of town. Tom's hands shook the entire time, but his voice, quiet and controlled, laid it all out. Years of deception. Sales quotas so absurd the only way to meet them was through lies. Bonuses for the highest interest rates. Rewards for burying customers in hidden fees. Darren knew it all. He encouraged it, expected it. Tom admitted to forging signatures, manipulating loan documents, shredding complaints before they ever reached the state. But he also painted a complicated portrait of Darren, not a monster, not a villain. A man who genuinely believed he was building something meaningful. A dealership that supported local sports teams, gave to food banks, hosted blood drives. Someone who saw the fraud as necessary, a small evil to sustain a bigger good. Tom didn't absolve him, but he humanized him. And as I listened to that testimony, hours of it, I realized something unsettling. Years ago, when I bought my first car, it was from a dealership owned by Roger O. Rogers, Darren's mentor. Looking back at my old paperwork, I found discrepancies I'd never noticed. I had been a victim of the very fraud I was now investigating. Too young, too trusting, too unaware at the time to recognize what had been done. The realization rattled me. This wasn't just about protecting future customers anymore. It was personal, but that only made it more critical to remain objective. I couldn't let my own history cloud the investigation. With Tom's testimony secured, I finalized my report. The evidence was staggering. Years of systematic fraud affecting hundreds of customers, adding up to millions in overcharges. But beyond the numbers, the report also captured the human toll. Employees forced to compromise their values just to keep their jobs. A business owner who convinced himself that serving the community somehow justified deceiving it. And innocent families, caught in the middle, left to pick up the pieces. As the 48-hour deadline loomed, I submitted everything to the Attorney General's office. The evidence clearly pointed to repeated fraud, but proving criminal intent remained a challenge. Darren could still argue that he was merely following the business methods taught to him by his mentor. And with Tom admitting he'd forged signatures, it muddied the chain of culpability. If anything, Tom's confession implicated himself more than Darren. The response came quickly. The state would proceed, but not with criminal charges. Instead, they would pursue regulatory violations. Belridge Motors would face hefty fines, mandated reforms, and sustained oversight. Darren wouldn't face prison. It felt like a hollow win. The public response was immediate and divided. Some community members celebrated, relieved that justice, however imperfect, had finally arrived. Others mourned what they saw as a blow to a business that had long supported local charities and sports teams. Darren's response was composed. At a press conference, he accepted responsibility, claimed he'd always intended to serve customers fairly, and promised transparency and reform moving forward. But when his eyes met mine across the room, the message behind them was anything but conciliatory. This isn't over. Though formal proceedings would take months, the immediate fallout began quickly. Belridge Motors' sales nosedived. Some employees quit. Others were laid off. The youth baseball team lost its primary sponsor. The ripple effects reached far beyond the lot, touching families who'd never even bought a car from Darren. I returned to my regular assignments, but everything felt different. Other dealerships treated me with suspicion. Colleagues kept their distance. My supervisor made it clear, while I had done my job, the political cost was high. My next performance review would reflect the disruption I'd caused. Tom McAllister vanished. His family relocated, but he never followed through with formal testimony. I heard whispers in agreement with his creditors, facilitated by someone with influence and deep pockets. I couldn't prove it, but the implications were unmistakable. Melissa Kurt's accounting firm barely survived the audit. She messaged me once, saying she didn't regret helping, but she couldn't afford to stay involved. Her family came first. I understood, but I felt the isolation closing in. Meanwhile, Darren adapted. He hired PR consultants, rolled out new oversight programs, installed third-party auditors. Slowly, he rebuilt his reputation. He began to rebrand himself as a reformed entrepreneur, a businessman who'd made mistakes but had learned from them. The narrative started to shift, and I could only watch as public opinion softened around him. My own name fared worse. Online chatter painted me as an aggressive bureaucrat who dismantled a cornerstone of the community over technicalities. The fact that hundreds of people had been overcharged got buried beneath the headlines about job losses and canceled donations. One evening, as I reviewed the case for the final time before archiving, I found something I'd missed. Buried deep in Melissa's spreadsheets was a pattern I hadn't fully appreciated before. The fraud hadn't been random. It had specifically targeted vulnerable groups, elderly customers, recent immigrants, individuals with limited English, low credit scores, people least likely to complain or understand the fine print. This wasn't just dishonest business. It was calculated. It was predatory. It was cruel. But it was also too late. The case had been resolved, the penalties finalized, the reforms drafted. Darren would pay the fines, he'd be monitored, but he'd remain in business. The system had worked, just as it was designed to. Not to deliver justice, but to preserve structure, to maintain appearance, to apply just enough consequence to calm the public, while still protecting those who knew how to play the game. I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by boxes of evidence that had consumed months of my life, and wondered, was it worth it? Innocent people had suffered. Guilty men had slipped past real consequences. The community was fractured, and the mechanisms that made the fraud possible, the culture of deceit in car sales, the systemic exploitation of vulnerable buyers, the shield of privilege protecting powerful businessmen, remained mostly untouched. But then I remembered Mrs. Liang, the elderly woman who'd been charged 18 interest. She'd sent me a card, a simple thank you note in careful handwriting. Inside she wrote, "You gave us our dignity back." Maybe that was enough. Maybe real change didn't come from sweeping victories or viral headlines. Maybe it came one family at a time. One abusive practice exposed, one vulnerable customer defended. The system was flawed, but that didn't mean we stopped fighting to fix it. As I packed up the case files and cleared my desk, I knew Darren was likely doing the same. Our battle had ended. But the deeper war, the one between exploitation and protection, was far from over. I had learned hard truths about justice, about the cost of standing up, about the burden of integrity in a world where compromise often ruled. The investigation had changed me. I was no longer naive. I was more cautious now. But I was also more committed. Because I had learned what it really meant to look away, and why I never would again. Then, the next morning, something unexpected happened. A compliance officer from Belridge's franchise headquarters arrived unannounced at my office. He carried boxes of documents from their internal audit. He looked uneasy, but determined. "We're conducting our own review," he said. Legal's worried this could ripple through the entire franchise network. He laid out the documents across my desk. Training manuals from the era of Roger Rogers, Darren's mentor. What they revealed reshaped everything. The fraud hadn't started with Darren. It had been written into the DNA of the business. The manuals used vague but strategic language, instructions about maximizing customer investment and interpreting rate tiers with flexibility. Everything carefully worded to dance around legality while still encouraging deception. And then there were the handwritten notes in the margins. Clearly, in Roger's handwriting. Next to a section on advertised APRs, he'd scribbled, "For show only." That line hit like a punch to the chest. Darren hadn't just inherited a dealership. He'd inherited a blueprint for fraud, a playbook disguised as policy, a system built on misinformation and manipulation. The compliance officer made their position clear. They wanted to distance the brand from Darren's behavior, but they also wanted protection. They'd cooperate quietly if their involvement remained confidential. They were ready to sacrifice one man to save the machine. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I spent days assembling the evidence into a story, one that exposed not just the fraud, but the institutional culture that enabled it. The challenge was framing Darren as both the perpetrator and the product of a corrupted legacy, without excusing what he had done. 3 days before the hearing, Jake showed up at my apartment. He looked exhausted, pale, constantly glancing behind him. He said things at the dealership were crumbling. Salespeople were turning on one another, each trying to reduce their own exposure. He wanted to testify, but he needed some kind of assurance that his cooperation would count for something when the penalties came down. I couldn't promise anything. But I listened. His testimony added more than I expected. The valve stem incident with my tires? It wasn't spontaneous. They'd done it before. It was a tactic used on problem customers who asked too many questions. The commission structure was even more abusive than I'd realized. Bonuses for pushing unnecessary warranties, incentives for selling bogus add-ons to elderly customers. Then he showed me his phone. Screenshots of text messages, threads of salespeople celebrating their wins over vulnerable buyers, photos of contracts, jokes at customers' expense, scoreboards of how much profit each had squeezed from the week's easy marks. It was worse than I thought. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and humid. The conference room at the state office building was packed standing room only. The front rows were filled with dealership owners, their faces tight with concern. Behind them sat Premier Auto employees, some who had walked out in protest, others who still hoped to keep their jobs, and behind them sat the customers, people who'd lost money, lost trust, lost time, people like Mrs. Liang, people who had come to see if their voices finally mattered, elderly couples, young families, single parents who'd all been overcharged. They filled the hearing room with silent presence, a living reminder of what this case was really about. Darren entered with his legal team, but the confident swagger he once carried was gone. His suit hung loosely, his frame thinner than before, evidence of stress-induced weight loss. There were deep circles under his eyes, the kind that come from sleepless nights. His hands trembled slightly as he organized papers at the respondent's table. When our eyes met, I didn't see anger or arrogance. I saw exhaustion. The hearing officer called the room to order. I began presenting the evidence, careful and composed. Starting with the Liang contract and building from there, I laid out the full architecture of the fraud. Each document displayed on the screen peeled back another layer of deception. And still, Tom's disappearance just before his scheduled testimony lingered like smoke in the air, too convenient for someone who had once been at the center of it all. His mysterious understanding with his creditors felt more like a payoff than a coincidence. His absence weakened the case that had so desperately needed his voice. The room stayed silent, punctuated only by gasps as audience members recognized pieces of their own experiences in the documents. Then came the franchise training materials. The moment those were projected, I noticed dealership owners in the front row shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Because now it wasn't just about Darren, it was about the system. A system of normalized manipulation, industry-wide practices disguised as best strategies. The hearing officer's expression grew more grave with each slide. Then Jake took the stand. His voice was unsteady, but his words were clear. He admitted to taking part in the fraud, but explained how deception had been presented as standard operating procedure. He described the pressure, the glorification of manipulation, the dismissal of anyone who questioned the ethics. The owners in the front row watched him with clenched jaws and narrowed eyes. His honesty put them all at risk, but the most powerful moment came when the hearing officer turned to Darren. "Do you have anything to say?" He rose slowly, one hand gripping the table to steady himself. His voice cracked from the first sentence. He spoke of arriving in the country with nothing, of getting his first job at one of Roger Rogers' dealerships as a teenager, of learning that success required flexibility. He truly believed, still seemed to believe, that he was helping people. Helping them get cars they otherwise couldn't afford, giving back through donations and sponsorships. But when he mentioned Sophie, his daughter, the last of his composure broke. She hadn't spoken to him since the investigation began. His wife had moved out, staying with her sister. The baseball team had found new sponsors, ones that now publicly distanced themselves from Belridge Motors. The dream he had built, piece by piece, had crumbled, and only now was he beginning to understand why. The hearing officer called for a recess. Out in the hallway, I overheard hushed conversations that revealed the growing ripple effects. Other dealerships were already rewriting their practices. Banks were reevaluating partnerships with high-risk dealers. Lawmakers were drafting legislation for greater transparency in vehicle financing. When the session reconvened, the hearing officer asked me to provide a recommendation on penalties. It was the moment I had dreaded. I had the power to recommend shutting Belridge Motors down completely. 50 jobs gone. Another shuttered building in a community that already had too many. Or I could push for structured reform, something that offered both justice and the possibility of change. I thought of Mrs. Liang and the others who'd been taken advantage of. But I also thought of the salespeople trapped in a toxic environment, the neighborhood that relied on the business, and the chance to force systemic reform from within. I recommended strict oversight, mandatory restitution with interest, and complete restructuring under state monitoring. Darren would be permanently barred from participating in financing, but if he complied with every measure, he could retain ownership. 2 hours later, the hearing officer returned with a decision. The commission would adopt my recommendations, with added conditions. Belridge Motors would undergo a full forensic audit of all past sales. All affected customers would be reimbursed. The dealership would operate under state supervision for the next 5 years. Every employee would be required to complete ethics and compliance training. More importantly, the findings would be shared across agencies, opening the door to broader investigations across the state. As the room emptied, the emotions were mixed. Some customers cried, hugged each other. Justice, imperfect but real, had finally come. Some employees looked relieved. Others looked afraid. And the dealership owners? They gathered quietly in tense circles, already planning their next moves, because they knew this wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning. Darren approached me in the parking lot. Up close, I could see just how much the ordeal had aged him. The lines on his face were deeper, his posture slightly stooped. He extended his hand. I hesitated, then shook it. He thanked me, genuinely, for not recommending a shutdown, for giving him a chance to make things right. He admitted he'd lost his way, said that Rogers' teachings had warped his understanding of what a legitimate business should be. He promised to rebuild ethically this time, though he understood it would take years to regain the trust he'd lost. Back at the office, I found my desk piled high with new files. My supervisor met me with unexpected news. The Premier Auto investigation had set off a chain reaction. Agencies in other states were requesting our findings. The legislature was fast-tracking the transparency bills. Real change was happening, slowly, but undeniably. Over the following weeks, I kept tabs on Belridge Motors' transformation. They brought in new leadership, implemented transparent pricing, and began issuing restitution payments. Some employees left, unwilling to adapt, but many stayed grateful for the chance to finally do their jobs with integrity. Darren stepped back, focusing instead on repairing relationships with his family. The ripple effects kept growing. Melissa Kurt's accounting firm gained new clients, dealerships now seeking honest financial guidance. Tom McAllister entered treatment for gambling addiction. His testimony had paved the way for other finance managers to step forward and share their own stories about pressure and fear. Jake found a second chance, working with consumer advocacy organizations, teaching people how to spot dealership scams and protect themselves. 3 months later, I received a letter from Sophie Darren. She thanked me for exposing the truth. She said it had forced her father to face who he had become. Their relationship was still fragile, but slowly healing. Inspired by everything that had happened, she'd started studying consumer law. She wanted to ensure others wouldn't go through what her family had. The Liangs sent another card this time with a photo of their grandson at his graduation. They'd used the restitution money to help pay for his college tuition. Mrs. Liang's note said my work had restored their faith in justice. Eventually, the state passed comprehensive auto sales reform mandating transparent pricing, outlawing bait-and-switch tactics, and enforcing stricter penalties for fraudulent behavior. Other states followed suit. The franchise's corporate headquarters implemented sweeping policy changes across the country. What had started as a single inspection became the catalyst for an industry-wide reckoning. I returned to my routine inspection work, but with new clarity. Each case now felt like more than a checklist. It was a chance to safeguard consumers while still understanding the human dynamics behind the mistakes. The Premier Auto investigation had taught me something essential. Justice doesn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it means prevention. My reputation evolved from the inspector who took down a dealership to the one who reformed how auto sales operated. Other dealers still watched me with caution. But some began to privately admit these changes were long overdue. The tone between inspectors and dealerships began shifting from hostility to wary cooperation. The case documents were archived, but their reach continued. Law schools began using the investigation as a case study. Consumer protection agencies cited it during trainings. The framework established during the hearing shaped how future enforcement would proceed. Change came slowly, systematically, one safeguard at a time. Sometimes when I drove past Bell Ridge Motors, I would glance at the lot. The flashy Zero banners were gone. In their place stood clearly posted pricing and detailed financing terms. The showroom that had once been the stage for chaos now functioned with transparency. Occasionally, Darren would be outside, older and grayer now, watching customers walk in and out. We would nod at each other not out of friendship, but mutual recognition. A shared history. The cost had been high. Careers ended. Families were tested. A community was shaken. But from the wreckage came something stronger. Better practices, stronger protections, proof that a business could be profitable and ethical. The investigation had ended, but its legacy lived on. Looking ahead, I knew more battles waited. Other industries had their own Roger Rogers, their own corrupted systems, their own vulnerable victims. But now I had experience. I had precedent. I had proof that change was possible. The war between exploitation and protection would never truly end. But every victory made the next fight a little easier. My Honda repaired and quietly reliable carried me forward. Each case brought new challenges, new resistance, and new chances to make things right. The work was demanding, often thankless, sometimes risky, but I kept going. I thought of Mrs. Liang's quiet dignity, of Sophie's courage to confront the truth, and even of Darren's eventual reckoning and efforts toward redemption. That made it worth it. What began as a case rooted in personal humiliation had evolved into professional victory, then into something deeper, a realization that justice doesn't exist only in punishment or accolades, but in that fragile space between accountability and transformation, between one person's wrongdoing and a system built to look the other way. That perspective became my compass for every case that came after.